Robert Hodgins is a man of many parts. Performer, lecturer, cook, gardener, artist, and most importantly, painter.
From, and it's been said very often, I'm a very English painter. I'm very much in the tradition of people like Freud and Bacon and so forth. Where I really come from is an immense love and respect of the idea of art, of it carrying weight, of it carrying importance, of it carrying personal intensity. I mean, I don't think I live any more intensely than when I'm in front of a canvas.
Robert has won countless awards and has been exhibiting his work since 1956. In an art world not known for a particularly generous spirit, it's common to hear his peers describe Hodgins as the best contemporary painter in South Africa today.
I mean, I see myself as a little guy who comes into the studio, opens the door in the morning, goes and washes his brushes, hangs them outside to dry, sometimes puts on his painting apron, sometimes doesn't, and then finds that he's stirring something, it gets all done. His clothes. I see the whole thing as quite a private, but also quite a simple thing. I'm not trying to be bashful and modest, but I mean, I'm surprised in a way that here I sit daubing. I mean, I think to start off with the idea of painting coloured mud on a flat surface and trying to make something important is slightly mad in spite of Velasquez, Michelangelo, whomever. It's slightly balmy. I mean, most human beings don't do anything like that once they've passed the age of 2.
Born in London in 1920 to Edith Hodgins, a single working-class woman, Robert happily spent the first 10 years of his life in an orphanage in the country. Then his mother brought him back to London.
One of the reasons my mother brought me back was that my schoolmaster and his wife wanted to adopt me. She had some problems, she didn't have children. And he had great plans for me. He was going to send me to Oxford and all kinds of things. My mother wasn't having this. She whisked me back to London, to the joys of Paddington. And later on to a place in Vauxhall, which meant that when she was out of she was out at work and I had nothing to do, I used to go into the Tate Gallery because it was, 3 blocks down. But the result was I discovered a lot of paintings, including, I don't know why, that Verhoeven pipe on the yellow chair, which is now in the National, but in those days was in the Tate. And I liked it, but I didn't know why I liked these things. I don't think I ever thought, well, somebody made these things, somebody put them on the wall, and I certainly didn't realize they're worth thousands of pounds, millions now, or I don't know what, there was a nice warm, dry place and there was interesting things to look at. And when we went back to Paddington, I used to go down and look at all the Victorian Albert museums around that area. And so I kind of filled myself with information and education without knowing I was doing it. And we had a very good, very, very good art mistress called Miss Gibb. And I remember one wet afternoon, she read us the account of the casting of Benvenuto Cellini's Perseus. He broke up the furnace to keep the furnace going in order, otherwise the whole thing will break down. And we all sat there, the young kids of, 12, I suppose, enthralled with this whole notion. And she was a very good art teacher. But where I got interested, I honestly don't know. It just sort of crept up on me, as they say.
Did you ever know your father?
No, but I found out about him when I was 45, and he was an absolute crumb. I mean, he ended up... do you know what a bookie's runner is? Gambling was vaguely illegal in England unless you were very rich and you belonged to Tattersall's, one of these things. And so there were these rather crummy guys who sort of sat in pubs and they took half a crown and 5 bob bets and they took a commission. And they fed, it was all totally legal. This apparently is what he was. It didn't weigh on me. I mean, it didn't weigh on me. Working class, things happen like that in the working class. We've been middle class, might be a different story, but we're working class. And Yet my mother was working middle class in outlook. I remember us listening. I was still at school, so I was under 14, to a socialist on a soapbox, literally on a soapbox, standing in a London street saying, we will take from the rich and give to the poor. And my mother turned to me and said, they want to take our stuff away and give it. And that never occurred. Well, I mean, at 14, I was hardly in a position to say, but we are the poor. Let's have some.
At 14, Robert went to work. An uneasy relationship with his mother disturbs him to this day.
Well, it was a pretty bleak life in some ways. So when Uncle Willie said, you want to come to South Africa, I leapt to the chance. And so I wrote to my uncle and said, look, are you serious? Because I don't have any money. And he sent me enough for a new suit, a pair of shoes for him, a pair of shoes for me, and a passage on the Edinburgh Castle. And he sent me £33. And I did all that on £33 and a little bit of saving. I landed in Cape Town on my 18th birthday. Everything seems to happen to me on the 27th of something. Again, the 27th of June 1938, I landed in Cape Town to find a large family waiting for me in the Harbour Cafe, which is where my uncle had a business and where we lived. And I stood in that cafe and listened to Chamberlain say, we are at war with Germany. Well, it wasn't compulsory to go, you know, and my uncle said, look, you're undereducated, you must get your matriculation.
Robert did finish schooling, although not quite before he joined the army. A brief, unsuccessful encounter with the infantry persuaded him to enlist with motor transport.
Now, remember, I couldn't drive. Remember, my family, there was only one member who had a car, and he wasn't lending it me to learn to drive. So they put us in a truck, and they took us along a perfectly flat piece of Transvaal road. They showed us how the gears worked, and how the clutch worked, and how the steering worked, and how the ignition worked. They put us in the car. We drove 2 miles along a flat thing. That was it.
I remember one incident which Rob wishes with all his heart that I would forget, and every time I think of it, I laugh. He came to South Africa from England and joined the army and went to the Western Desert, Second World War. And he was given a Jeep, taught how to drive it, and he went driving into the endless desert, a very narrow track, not another thing in sight, not a camel, nothing. When suddenly on the road, coming from a very long distance away, is another Jeep, and Robert drove straight into it. I've never particularly wanted to get into a car with him ever since.
I had a great war. I mean, it's a terrible thing to say. I had a great war. I mean, I was a pretty feeble soldier. I mean, the only occasion I ever fired my rifle at a range, I nearly shot the sergeant major, and he came up to me and said, you are going to carry that rifle till the day you're discharged. You're never going to shoot it again, I promise you.
Let's go to the end of 1945. You're discharged from the army and you're in England.
England at that time were very short of teachers. Obviously, a lot of the male teachers had just been killed off or changed their mind, maybe, I don't know. So they pumped us into a course which was a very heavy course. And one of the things about this course was you had to do 2 special subjects. And at the beginning of the course, the appropriate tutors got up and said, you should take my subject because. And the art guy got up and said, you must take my subject because the one thing you'll find is the kids are never bored and never badly disciplined. And after 5 years of being in the army, I was scared stiff of facing little kids. That's why I started art.
After completing a teacher's training course, Robert taught at a school while pursuing his art studies part-time at Goldsmiths College. He then enrolled full-time at Goldsmiths, alongside the likes of Bridget Riley and Mary Quant.
And at first I wanted to specialize in illustration because I thought I might earn a living. But we spent the first week drawing a letter from the Trajan column and copying a Punch cartoon from the 1890s. And after a week of this, I was reduced to a state of screaming impotence and went and said, I want to become a painter. And the head of the school said, but Hodgins, you'll never earn a living. So I said, well, I don't mind, because I really want to teach anyway, but I want to be a painter. I don't want to spend the rest of my time doing wonderful serifs on beautiful Roman letters. I mean, it kills one.
Faced with the reality of no teaching jobs in England, Robert wrote to a friend in South Africa who assured him teachers were needed here. Robert returned by ship to Cape Town.
And then came up to Joburg and found there were no jobs after all. There were jobs teaching English and South African history. There were no jobs teaching art. And so Bob Courtney, the famous Bob Courtney, who was a friend of this friend of mine, said, look, I tell you what, I'll get you a job as a cinema manager. So off I trotted to African films, and they said, yes, you must get yourself a tux, and on Monday you start training as a cinema manager. Of course, you're very old. I was 33. You're very old to become a cinema manager, but we'll take you on for Bob Courtney's sake. That was Tuesday, Wednesday. Then on Thursday, Walter Battis rang up this guy and said, do you know if anybody who wants a job at the Pretoria Tech? And he said, yes. So that night I mounted all my little drawings and took all my little paintings and so went over to Pretoria Tech, and on Friday got this job.
There Robert met Jan Neethling, in whose Midrand Johannesburg house he now lives. At that time, Jan was one of Robert's students. What kind of a lecturer was Robert?
Well, he was never dull. He could be very amusing, you know, and I think that was one of the things I liked about him. It was never a dull moment, whereas with the other tutors, a class would sometimes sort of drag on, you know, but never with Hodgins.
He was a mess as a lecturer. I mean, he was a buddy as a lecturer. You know, he was very, very good in terms as a practical lecturer. Although I didn't do practical art, but in a disorganized, sort of all over the place kind of way. His real strength, I think, as a teacher was one-to-one relationship and making people think and relating, you know, rather than kind of putting together good comprehensive notes about things. I mean, he was never interested in that. It was much more a lived, passionate involvement, which, you know, which is another way of saying that he was an extremely good teacher, because that's the only way you really teach, by engaging people in the subject.
Robert remained at the Tech for 8 years, until 1962, when he was approached by his friend Otto Krause to join forces with him on a current affairs magazine called Newscheck.
Then I became a journalist. And I'd never written for a magazine or a newspaper before. And I said, Otto, you know, this is absurd. I mean, why are you employing me? He said, I know that you can. So he said, all I can offer is £40 a month. So I said, look, I'm so glad to get out of Pretoria. Fine. And so I stayed in his flat, which saved me rent, and we launched this magazine called Newscheck. Well, it was the hardest work I've ever done. And it went on for about 3 years, and I rewrote and I wrote, and I was the art critic and the ballet critic and the music critic and the opera critic and the book critic, and also interviewed people in strange places all over the place. It was a very strange life and very exhausting. And I began to realize that this was... Every now and then, I resigned 14 times. And every now and then, I'd resign and take up painting, and it wouldn't work, and I'd go crawling back. And then about 3 months later, I'd resign again and go back to painting. So this was a crazy period. And if we move into the house, I'll show you the only piece of work that survives from that time, which was a drawing I did. I was sharing a flat with Jan. And Jan came in and said, I want that drawing for my birthday, and that's the only reason it survived.
Robert finally resigned when he was offered a job in the fine art department at the University of Witwatersrand.
I was 46 when I hit them, but I felt very young and very enthusiastic, and I started exhibiting, slowly painting and exhibiting again, and yeah, and I got lovely long sabbaticals and went overseas, which I hadn't done since I arrived in 53, looked at a lot of paintings, and no, the Wits years were very good, very good.
By now, Robert was an established artist with many solo and group exhibitions to his credit. But it was during a sabbatical in the 80s that he reached a turning point. A consuming interest in playwright Alfred Jarry's character Ubu Roi led him to develop his own Ubu family, a family of clowns in power whose comic facade disguises their evil intent.
In 1981, in that 6 months, I did a whole series of Ubu paintings and had an exhibition in a little gallery called Carriage House. And this was my first critical success. I mean, then people began to think, yeah, well, there's something to me. I may have been exhibiting since 1956, 23 years. But no one had taken much notice. Fairly respectful reception, but, you know, I was old Josu painting quite a bit. The Ubu paintings really got people going. And from there on, it began to rocket. And, you know, it's absolutely true, nothing succeeds like said. The fact that I was taken seriously did something to make me take my work more seriously in some kind of strange way.
It's probably the very first of the Ubu series, which was like the sort of breaking point, the point where everything changed for Hodgins. And I mean, you look at it, it's got a bit of George Gross and a bit of Otto Dix, and it's got a lot of other references. What starts to happen here is the way that form gets broken up and it sort of shifts in and out of focus, and the way like the reality, sort of received reality, you know, goes through this weird sort of sea change. And I mean, that really for me is the essence of what Hodgins is about.
Robert's really an international artist. He doesn't subscribe to any movements here or consider himself to be part of the new South Africa or the old South Africa, for that matter. He just paints.
It has been for me quite one of the most extraordinary things to see how Robert has changed from a man who really was regarded as a good painter, a superb teacher, incidentally. All I know about painting, Robert taught me. But people used to look at his paintings and say, oh, isn't that beautiful? In that faintly condescending manner that they have about paintings in other people's houses. And then suddenly, I don't know what triggered it. I myself thought it might have been the change in South Africa, it might have been what was happening in South Africa. He is painting, and you know, he's no longer a very young man. He is painting the most remarkable stuff.
In 1986, Robert's Wits colleague Alan Crump suggested a retrospective exhibition in tribute to the artist.
We got this big exhibition together of work going right back to Goldsmiths, a couple of works I'd hung on to. And we had this big retrospective of something like 140 painting works at the Grahamstown Festival. And again, it was a birthday, the 27th of June. It was my 66th birthday. And I had finished art school 33 years before. So what was shown was virtually exactly half a lifetime, which was very thrilling. My studio is my biggest possession, my dearest possession. And I love it because I can wander into the studio and look at paintings, and the size of that studio is important because I have all the paintings up and only work on a painting when I'm absolutely certain I know what I've got to do. It might be putting on a 1/4 inch of red or recovering a whole area or putting an extra piece drawing. But the great thing about that is that you don't waste time.
But now you're working on all of these at once?
Yes. Well, I mean, some of them sort of sit around for a couple of months without anything happening. I do try and do the things I know I've got to do so that I don't spend a lot of time scraping out and bashing up. And
Are you a disciplined painter?
Fairly. I get great bursts. I mean, in '93, towards the middle, I really thought, well, you know, your talents just floated off and you'll never get paint again. Forget it. And it started suddenly building up, and suddenly I produced something like 20 paintings in 3 months. Boom, 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 boom.
Is there a process which Robert follows?
No, I tell you why I don't have any process, because I know so much about painting now, after 30, God knows years, that if I do have a definite process, I'm terrified I fall into tricks and habitualities. But what I want all the time is to be surprised. I want to say, well, where did you get it from? Where do you remember it from? Oh, yes. That bad movie with Humphrey Bogart, of course, yes, you know. But I don't want to say that I'm going to paint a picture of Humphrey Bogart in a dingy office.
There have been many surprises in his collaboration with William Kentridge and Deborah Bell, and a Kentridge movie character has greatly inspired Robert.
William put me in his suit. Now, I haven't worn a suit for 25 years since mine was stolen by burglars in West End. And we flattened my hair, and I looked at myself in the mirror, and that wasn't me. It was a doppelganger thing. Now, that was quite interesting because it was a holiday for myself, and what William creates me to do in that suit. And this set a whole sort of idea of suits. Now, what are suits? Partly they're a sign that you're a gentleman. As far as painting is concerned, it's useful if you put a suit, whatever you put on top has to be a head. So you can explode that head into almost a Jackson Pollock blur. And I think my feeling about these businessmen of mine is they're partly villains and they're partly victims. The fact that they're enclosed in a suit makes them masterful. It also means they're enclosed in a suit. They haven't got much freedom. They can't move, they can't dance, they can't spring. They've got a suit on.
These days, Robert is a full-time painter whose own life is far removed from that of his businessmen. He loves pottering in the garden, growing herbs, pruning roses, and sharing Jan's rustic surroundings. Do Jan and Robert have many shared interests?
Yes, one very common one, and that's eating good meals. So the Hodgins cooks.
On a classical note, we do like music.
Oh, yes. And looking
He's
at...
jazz, I'm classical, but we cross borders.
Oh, yes, well, no, I like classical music very much.
Well, if you look at the shelves and discover that I have that Phillips collected Mozart, I think you could say that Mozart is my top bin. You know.
Robert had his CDs, his Mozart CDs, spread out on the table. And somebody came in and said, Robert buys Mozart by the meter.
The kitchen is where Robert indulges another great passion.
Right. Now, you know I told you that when I was boy 10, the food was terrible. And so I've always loved good food. And Madeleine van Billon, the columnist, when I moved to Joburg from Pretoria, said, look, you've got to be serious about this. So she gave me my first cookbook, the Esquire Cookery Book. And I never looked back. And partly one of the things that I think I like cooking, apart from the byproducts, is that if you get a good recipe book and you've got a good recipe and you stick to it, you can't go wrong. I actually think I learned to cook in the bath because my favourite thing in the evening is to have a dry martini or whiskey and soda, get into a bath and stay there reading cookery books. And that's where, actually, this is why we come to this menu. I found this in Grigson the other day. It's a Greek bean salad called Pafulia, but don't ask me the correct pronunciation. You know, I'm always very impressed in a book about D.H. Lawrence, of all people. It said that he made a relish of doing things. There was an occasion when he was in a house in Mexico and he scrubbed the floor. And he actually scrubbed the floor with relish. So that he tried to bring to ordinary things the passion of his novels. Now, I feel that very strongly, and I like to feel that you know, the painting and the cookery are not two things apart, and the painting and these absurd movies I make are not two things apart. They're all part of a real great joy I have in being alive in 1996. I've never owned a house. I've had flats and lived in other people's houses, flats in other people's houses, and for a year I looked after Skukuza's house in White River while his widow was away fixing up his Scotch inheritance.
I've often been asked why I have such a passion for Robert Hodgins' work. When he was living down in White River, he used to send me letters, screeds and screeds of letters, in which he explained painting to me. They were immensely valuable to me. He, in fact, told me once, I've never forgotten it, that Renoir's paintings were so almost voluptuous because he painted with his penis. It was a marvelous remark, and it stuck obviously in my mind. But Rob gave me a phrase which I have retained after all these years, and it's a very long time ago, that if you look at a painting and it gives you a lift of the heart, it must be good or have something good in it. And all of his paintings have that quality for me.
I think, well, I mean, I have a feeling about this, that, I finally come to there's no more moves. And Jan is not very keen on us to move either. So unless we have some huge row for some reason I can't imagine, I'm going to be here. This is where, I've told you my ambition is to get up on my 100th birthday and start a new canvas. This will be where it happens.